You missed a page from Telebot. 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 Telebot.
Hello and welcome back to the SRE podcast. This is a limited series where we're discussing concepts from the SRE book with experts around Google. I'm Viv and I'm your host today, along with MP.
Hello.
And we are here today with Pierre to talk about automation. Hi, Pierre.
Hello.
You want to tell us a little bit about yourself and your work at Google?
Yeah, of course. So I'm Pierre. I've been an SRE at Google for a long time now. I've been at Google as a SRE since the beginning for 14 years. I'm more on the software engineering side of SRE in general. I've been working on Gmail-related topic for the longest time as an SRE, where I learned a lot about how to run large production system. But nowadays, I'm working on something called prospect handling. So that's what a big chunk of Google production is using nowadays for doing continuous deployment. So how to manage your production configuration at scale, because, well, we have a lot of things which tends to get in conflict. So that tends to be a lot of work. So that's what I do at Google. And outside of that, I'm a nerd. So usually I do all computer related stuff. I like graphic rendering, programming in general. And outside of that, when I'm not talking about computer stuff, I'm probably talking about food, usually.
I love it. Those are all great topics. So automation, I guess the first question I'd have is, why should you automate? What are the main reasons to kind of go in that direction?
Why would someone want to automate? Because automating something it is actually a bit of work, and it's not always needed. So from what I've seen, there are usually two main reasons, I guess. Let's see, One is related to toil, and the other one is related to safety. So the toil related is, toil as in, there is something that you need to do. You have the impression that you need to do it often, and it's frustrating to do. That's usually a fairly big criteria. It might not take that much time in the end, but it's very frustrating. So there is this ratio of frustration versus time. And usually that's an excellent sign that you want to automate it, because for many people it's more fun to automate it in the first place than to do the toil thing. And that can end up with a better result, and you might have more time to work and improve other part of your system. So toil is what I've seen as usually being the main motivation or the biggest factor for automation. Safety will be probably the second one. I'm probably forgetting something, but safety is also commonly mentioned because we know that us as humans tend to do mistakes, and sometimes very dumb mistake, and automation can avoid a whole class of problems. It does replace it with another class of problems, but it does help with a large chunk of issues. So having a computer systematically verifying that, all those 5 properties before pushing something are verified is better than someone who is going to be tired these days. They had some family problem and they are going to screw it up, or just because, we do random screw ups. So that's quite often the other reason why people want to automate. I've noticed at least.
I noticed you mentioned that, as you said, automation can take a lot of time. It can be consuming up front. So it is putting the work up there. So it does sound like there are a lot of good reasons to automate. Do you always kind of move in that direction first, or when do you make that call?
Yeah, and it's not always easy to determine that, right? So I have my software engineering side, which makes me always want to automate. There are wonderful case studies about the cost of automation. That does not necessarily make it a good idea all the time. I guess there's probably a few things to look into. I've mentioned the frustration of people having to do the work. I think that's a very important one because, people prefer to work on interesting stuff. I mean, that's kind of a tautology, right? And so if you can automate something that is frustrating, that would be an excellent sign that, it's pretty worth spending the time on that. There's also a whole project management side of it. So that's less of my domain, but in the end, if you're doing that in context of a company or an organization of some sort, there will be some trade-off about the time you need to spend up front. Do you have the time to do it now? Is that worth the time, or are you just spending 2 quarters of work for saving a week of work? Maybe that's not worth it. So that's the whole project management kind of things. And from that, I we believe that automation is not necessarily different from many other projects. That's like looking at the trade-off both from a human people perspective and from a technical perspective. There are other things to take into account is the difficulty of doing it, because there are some problems which are easy to automate. And even if the gain is not that clear, if it takes you 2 hours, yeah, maybe just do it. And some others which might save you a lot of time, but the end result is not clear. Is the end result going to be actually saving that much time, or will it break down every time you use it? And that will be also a criteria to determine whether you want to automate something or not. That one, I've noticed that it's very, very hard to tell up front. Like the number of times that we thought that we were going to automate something that's, it's going to be great. We have like these procedures that people follow up. And of course we can automate that. And then we realize, it's breaking every single time because, it's actually difficult to measure this metric to know if the push is working, or it's difficult to model that because it's changing all the time and so on. I think, and what to automatize also is probably a criteria. People care about automation. It's a generalization, so that goes as far as it goes as within a generalization, but there are things about your production that you care more than others. And in the sense that you will look more at the details. So, for example, all of the services I know, there is usually at least like this one big central server that's a really important part. That's where all of the engineering bandwidth is going. And then there is all the supporting servers that people don't really care about. They are necessary. When they will be down, you will probably still have an outage, unfortunately. But they are less on top of people's mind. And I found out that things which are more on the sidelines is prime spot for automation, because people will not care about the details of how it happens. They just don't expect that it happens. And their automation will be great. I guess it's a variation of the pet versus cattle metaphor. When you consider it as a pet, automation might help. Definitely its place, but that might not be the best where to start. While the cattle side, you will probably want to automatize it because you don't care how it happens. You just want it to happen. And you probably have a lot of it also. So that's where I will usually start for determining what is automating, what needs to be automated.
So in terms of automating, what does it actually mean to automate a system?
What does it mean and how much do we want to automate? That's an excellent question, and one reason is that it's one of my pet peeves of mine, is that about automation. When automation for me makes a lot of sense. However, one thing which makes far less sense to me is automation tools. Like there is this whole ecosystem of tools which seems that, those are automation, and those for me makes far less sense. They have their space in industrial automation, but here I'm thinking more of automatizing your production, which is running on Google Cloud, on AWS, and so on. So this kind of large internet services, typically production. And for me, automating is the process of going from something that has been done manually to an extent. So there are subtleties, of course, but from going from something manual to something which is part of your service. It's not something special. It's not necessarily a workflow or anything. It might be, but it's really part of your service. So do I have an example for that? For example, for managing a mail system, a web mail system, let's say, and you need to deal where each mailbox is located. So you need to manage the load. You have like 2-3 regions, maybe, and you need to manage the load. And initially, you start with a small service. So from time to time, you have someone who looks into it and see, this cell over there is a bit overloaded. I should probably move more people there or create new people there. And you do that manually. Initially, it works because you don't have many users. That's great. And then you realize that it starts to get annoying. People do mistakes while doing it and so on. So all the usual sign of, we should automate that. And here you can have two approaches. One is, we have documentation about it. So I'm going to take the documentation. I'm going to use one of those automation tools, and I'm going to implement this process. Or you can change a bit the perspective on it and instead think, now I have my system and I want it to automatically manage the location of my users. There will be a bunch of criteria. The load is one of them. And for me, the second approach is going to work a lot better. Like taking a process which was made to human and transform it into automated step, but very similar, do not work well. I've never really understood why it does not work well, but in practice it does not. It's those processes never end up working well. I don't know why. I guess one of the reasons that usually they are not run all the time, so things break down over time. The constraints of what is doable by a human is very different from what a computer is good at doing. And so that's a different constraint. And so, yeah, changing the perspective is that, no, you're not building automation. You're building your service. You're building infrastructure. And here the constraint is that I want to keep the load of my users, my mailbox, properly balanced. How I will do that? I will probably have something which continuously verify the loads, take at the 7 days average, whatever, and go from there. Sometimes you might end up with the same result. Continuous integration, so the process of creating your next version of your binary, quite often looks very similar. But the perspective, I think, is important there. I think there was a second part of your question. Yes. Oh, yeah. How much should be automated, and what's the place of the humans and people in this automation? I guess, especially, I think I mentioned something like, automation is about going from something manual to something part of your infrastructure. I would like to say that, it means that everything is done by the computer, and then you don't have anything to do. That would be great. The reality of all the system I had to manage is that I've rarely seen a system that run itself. In the end, there is always something to do. So I would imagine that the answer is not clear-cut about what the involvement of humans is here. I guess there are different aspects to consider. So first, the involvement of people is probably going to have a lot of variation. There is a difference because why are they involved? Is that, is someone involved because they have to fix a bug? Okay, those we're still going to have. I mean, we try to reduce them, but it only goes that well. And then there are the involvement because it's part of the process. Like the typical case is approval. Like there is an approval step. For the example of like moving your mailbox around, maybe you want someone to validate the new layout of your production when it rebalances things, and you want a human in the process. So for the first one, for bugs and so on, that's going to happen. Here you want to reduce that. And I would say that's more of a sign of a failed automation or not. If people often need to fix those bugs, probably your automation is off the mark. That something's missing. It's hard to understand ahead of time, but once you start running into the problem, it might be easier to identify that. It's really difficult to know whether a user move actually worked because there is this mystery box over there which does not do what we think it does. And so that makes all of the automation not work. The manual part, like as in manual as expected and as part of the process. So the typical one is wanting to have human validation. This one I never know what to do with. Internally, in general, so at Google, in general, our approach is that we should have the least amount of that possible for infrastructure management. There are many things at Google. And for infrastructure management, in general, that should be automated. And the reason usually is that we consider that the decision that someone will take will not be as good as what the computer is going to do. And it is true to an extent, and we see that when it comes to evaluating the quality of a release. So you have a new version of your binary, you push it to a canary, and it's running on the canary. And so before continuing to push to the rest of production, you want to evaluate that. That's normal. And it used to be the case that the instruction in the playbook was saying, go look at the graph. Good luck. And instead, we replace that nowadays. We have systems which looks at those graphs automatically. And it's great because I don't like to do manual work. And we have pushbacks on that initially because your automation is going to miss things which looks obvious to humans. Like, there was obviously a spike, and because you did some kind of statistical analysis. I don't know anything about statistical analysis, but we do a lot of them, I know for that. And your statistical analysis missed this obvious spike. That sucks. But overall, for these kind of things, we've noticed that, it's clear-cut that humans are missing things all the time. The automated one might miss something that someone would have caught, but overall is going to be better. There is still space, I think, for a bit of manual approval. And it depends on the impact of a wrong decision. The impact, and that includes the mitigation. So For example, if you push a stateless front-end server, a bad stateless front-end server by mistake, I mean, it's not great. You will lose traffic. Definitely. We try to avoid that, obviously, but you can just roll it back to the previous one. And chances are that that's going to be fine. Now imagine another case where you're trying to update a database schema. So you have your database schema, you add new columns, you add a new type of data, or worse, you remove data from your database. Now the cost of, exactly. So deleting the data, that's always an interesting one with automation. And the cost here of doing a mistake is much, much, much higher. Because, well, you deleted the data. Hopefully you have backup. It's not a strategy. So you have backup. Let's assume that you have backups. But even then, that's going to take time and so on. And all those variation. I've seen outages, for example, where there was a small bug and that generated corruption into the data. Well, that's a lot more work than just a rollback to fix. And here, those kind of cases, in my opinion, might do with an extra layer of approval, like to sanity check. Because yes, the automation, the computer will pick up a lot of things, and then we add the toil of the human will pick another set of mistakes and go with that. Yeah, and in general, that's what we're doing. We remove most manual approvals, except I think we do have one for some database management and things like that.
There's one case of automation that I'm a little curious about. I'm trying to figure out how to describe it well. I think it might actually fall in the category of kind of a roundabout manual approval. When you have kind of a free-floating parameter for your system, and you're allowing automation to basically manage that value for you, but you put limits on what that value could be, and occasionally a human has to go and adjust those values so that the automation can keep doing its thing. It kind of gets stuck on the edge of its limits.
Yeah.
Because if you made the parameter space 0 to infinity, your automation might just try to drive it to infinity, and then it causes other problems. Does that kind of fall in the manual approval space, or is that a slightly different?
That's a very interesting question. I know less about those systems. We typically, I've seen a lot of those type of automation for managing the shape and the size of your job, like the amount of memory you're using, the number of tasks. There's a typical example that comes to mind from what you describe. And I guess it's a type of manual approval. That's true, because the reason I will add those limits in the first place is a sanity check, is that, I want that to adapt the thing automatically. Exactly like you said. But I don't understand the system that well. I know that our systems are awfully complex, so we cannot predict everything, unfortunately. And I know that, if it starts using no memory or more memory than a single machine has, for example, the obvious extreme, I don't want that. And probably, I don't understand how this system is going to work well, so I'm going to put limitation. And in a way, that's very similar to those manual approval, where it's to catch a different type of mistake that the computer can do, but a human can trivially block. This kind of automation is also, I never know what to do with this kind of automated adaptation, because the failure mode it's very useful, because you start a new server, you want multiple copies of it, they might have very different load profile, for example, so that just adapts automatically. I avoid the toil of having to tune all of them. That's great. But they have another effect, which they hide other problems. And so you're going to have, for example, your memory usage, which is going to slowly creep up. And then suddenly, you cannot start your new job, which is like at the other end of your production, like completely unrelated, but you cannot do it because it's been blocked by this small automation over there. It's a tough one. What we do for, and that goes away from the manual approval, but for this kind of metrics, when we do automated evaluation of a push, but in any automated evaluation of a change, there are two approaches that we take. And it depends on whether you know what normal means. So normal in the context of your monitoring, typically, is that. And there is one approach with all this statistical analysis, which is, you don't know what normal is, but it's going to tell you if that changes significantly. It helps with problems creeping up a bit to an extent. And then there is the one which is close to those like limits that someone placed explicitly, where I say, yeah, I think that, I don't know, I think the number of RPC errors I want to have, yeah, it should be around 0.1%, for example, because I know my system, that's how it is. And that can be also used to evaluate things. But that changes a lot of things on how to evaluate the result of the automation in the end.
Yeah, there's a lot of different, I guess, factors that play in. So I'm curious, when designing an automation system, does it vary between, whether or not you think that it'll be mostly totally on its own, no human approvals needed, versus like you think it will have more of that, I don't want to say collaboration, right? But if you are anticipating humans to have to kind of do the sanity check for you.
Yeah, I guess that I will typically start with, I don't want to have people in the loop. And then when I'm forced to have them, I will add questions to people. And when I'm forced, I don't necessarily mean by someone, most of the time, but forced because, here I just cannot get a signal, for example. Like I cannot evaluate the outcome of that. It's just too complicated or too noisy. That would be a typical case. I'm only joking about being forced because there is also a perception problem. So a bit further away from the purely technical, whatever that means, aspect of things, in the sense that, well, in the end, there is still probably someone responsible for the system. Like, it will be an SRE on call. We need to understand how things work, and we'll want to learn about how this automation work and build confidence on that. And that's a place where it can be actually useful to have those kind of human checkpoint in the middle, even if they are for the show. They are not really, but because they help build confidence. Because, I've just adopted this new system over there, which promised me to be completely intent by this magical. I describe my things in this place over there, and then my production is going to be safely updated. It's great. And trust me, it's going to work. So, as an SRE, typically you will be a bit skeptical of that, because op is not a strategy, as the saying goes. So you want to build confidence. It's a new system, you don't know it, and it's perfectly normal. And here, I do think that's actually one of the cases where it can make sense, ask for approval in the middle. That will make people, that just helps as people get more confidence because they know that the system is not going to progress on its own because they're in the middle. They can take a look at it. And hopefully, after a few weeks where they have to go click that, usually the reaction of most people is that, can I have something which clicks the button automatically? That, glad you asked, I'm going to remove the button, and then everyone is happy. Or the other way around is that every time someone checks, they need to fix something, and then, maybe we need to go back to the drawing board. So I guess that that can provide a very good feedback loop to improve your automation also.
Yeah, I think the other one that I've seen in several different places is like a dry run mode. So it's not even asking for an approval or going to attempt to do anything. It's just always telling you, well, if you let me, this is what I would be doing.
Yeah. The dry run mode, when it is possible to do a dry run mode, is indeed a great way to build up confidence. I like to know what is going to happen, and I've noticed that I'm not the only one, indeed. Is that, that's what's going to happen, and I know I can run it without touching production. Hopefully the dry run is indeed dry run. I'm not going to say I've never had a postmortem where the dry run was not a dry run, but that's a different story, I guess.
Uh-oh.
I might have taken down Gmail this way. But the dry run is... is a very useful tool. What I've noticed, though, in those prospect annealing I was mentioning, so what we're using for continuous deployment those days in many parts of Google, is that there are some things which are very difficult to have a dry run for. And we have this intent-based system where we decide what we are going to push next, evaluate what we've pushed, and then decide, now we know that we can update this place because it's for the user who are currently sleeping. I don't know, making things up here, right? It's a very dynamic system and a dry run. And the system fundamentally is built onto the result of evaluating the push. Like you modify something, you evaluate it. And doing a dry run on that is tricky. You can say, I'm just going to assume that it passes. That the result passes in my dry run, in my simulation. But that only give relatively little information. yeah. I guess the bottom line is sometimes it's harder to do a dry run than others. But when it's possible, yeah, by all means, that's a very good tool. There are variations of dry run also. What's dry run means for one person can sometimes differ from another person because we tend to have multiple layers of automation, I guess. One thing is going to tell something else to modify something else. There is maybe a cache in the middle and some state keeping over there. Is that, okay, what are you allowed to actually modify in your dry run and what do you don't want to touch? It's usually not too much of a problem, but from time to time it can get interesting.
This is maybe going back a little bit, but I really like build confidence as kind of a tip or guideline for maybe what your system should be striving for. I am curious, do you have any other tips or guidelines on what your system should include? And in particular, as you just mentioned, if it's interacting with other automation systems, I guess for both cases, like what are good things to consider?
Yeah, how to build confidence and improve, get people to use it if you believe that's the thing to use and so on. Yeah. So I guess I'm going to talk largely in the context of intent-based systems here. So there is often this big type of automation, imperative and intent-based. Imperative, that's your automation, you're going to describe the steps. Is that, first build the binary, then run in canary and verify that, then push to cluster A, then push to region B. Things like that, very, very fixed. And then the intent-based, which is, I want the new version of the binary over there, and your automation behind the scene, well, not too much behind the scene, but the automation knows that, before I can push it everywhere at once, I need to test it somewhere. Or also I'm not allowed to push it all at once, so I just need to pick a place to start it. So that's in the intent-based. And one thing which is tricky with this type of automation is that it's quite often disconnected from what the user do. So the user do a modification somewhere, and actions are going to start in another place. While in an imperative style workflow, that quite often the person is going to say, push my config now, or push my new version now. So in the intent-based, there is this disconnect, and it means that when there is a problem, the person in charge of the system will have no starting point. Like, something is wrong. Is it damn automation again, which caused problem? And they're probably right, to be fair, but that's very tricky, and that's very tricky to build confidence based on that. And here, that led me to the belief that the UI of automation is absolutely fundamental. That's actually the most tricky part to a large extent of automation, and that's including to help build confidence is how do you represent it? What do you show? Which kind of control do you give the user? How do you navigate the information overload? Though I do have a preference for information overload versus not having the information, but it's tricky to balance. And that's actually one challenge that we're struggling with. No, it's not true. We have plenty of good solid solution and so on, but that's a very tricky part. And I think it might be worse by... There are people like me who like writing code, and so I'm usually the first one to want to automate something. And UI might not be the first thing on my mind. I don't mind writing UI. Actually, I do enjoy writing a bit of UI, but that's not the first thing I do. Let's put it that way. And it's very easy to fall into that trap. I think I've seen that I'm not the only one in that situation, I've noticed. And it's very easy to fall into that trap where you think and concentrate on doing the automation, because that looks like the difficult part, when the difficult part might be the actual UI. And the UI will be fundamental to help people debug, to build confidence, and so on. I was mentioning industrial automation. So those big factory, like chemical factory, where you don't have a complicated process, but when the process goes wrong, you might kill everyone around. Like dangerous process, things like that. And this kind of automation, obviously there are different constraints, so that it's approached differently. But this type of automation very often has a very strong component of how to show it. And you will see this very simple diagram. Maybe the process behind it will even be simplified just to be able to have a clear idea of what's happening. Obviously, when you're automating how to push your front-end server, the risk is very different, so the trade-offs are very different. But still, I do think the representation of automation is actually a challenge and a good way to build confidence at the same time. So probably good places to investigate.
You mentioned intent versus imperative. And then also a while back, I know you were talking about part of like automating might be either choosing to implement what the user would typically do. I think he used a general existing process or kind of shifting the perspective. Do those map to each other? Like, does one translate into imperative and the other into intent, or is that a separate result?
Yeah, I think they will often map. They are at least very correlated. Not necessarily, but they will be often correlated. And I think there is space for both, for the imperative and the intent one. I mean, I've spent the last few years working on an intent-based system, so I'm clearly biased toward intent-based automation, but I do think there is clearly space for things which just work better as imperatives. So there's a bunch of trade-off. One of them that was mentioning that intent might be harder to debug because it's harder to determine what the system is going to do. While with imperative, you might have even written yourself those steps. So it's very easy to understand. So, and that also ties back to the pet versus scatter, is that it's a part of your system that you really care about the various steps. You want tight control, like every week, maybe you're going to adjust a bit the steps. Imperative is probably going to be the way to go. For all the rest, that should probably be intent-based. And from what I've seen, also people tend to go more on the imperative side because people like to, and it's not, I mean, it's normal, me too, like to have control over their things, and the imperative workflow tends to give you this impression of control. But moving to intent has also benefits because, well, first it might automate more, so it's likely to break less often to a large extent. And that allows also to encode many rules across what would be different type of workflows. When you write a workflow, you do that from the perspective of one update you have to do. Like, I want to update my binary, so you're going to write that. But your system is likely more complicated than a single binary, because maybe first you have 10 binaries to run, and then you have the configuration of your database, you have your PubSub to configure, your load balancer, and then there is probably Kubernetes in the mix somewhere, which probably needs some configuration, and so on and so on and so on. When you take the perspective of an imperative workflow, you're going to miss all of that. So you're going to need to plan about, okay, how does that interact with, there is another workflow. And people don't do that in the end because it's complicated. With intent-based, you can have a better picture of what needs to happen. And then, oh yeah, I'm just going to stop there, the push of my new binary, because I just saw that there was a change in the database schema 10 minutes ago, and I should not modify the binary because that might be too dangerous to do it now. So it gives you more options to do that. It also quite often, the intent-based allows to shift, how to put that, everything that people have learned over time on how to, I'm missing an expression here, how people have learned how a proper push should be done in your company, in your project, whatever. That allows you to encode that much more easily in an intent-based system compared to a workflow, while workflow tends to encourage a lot of customization. So when you want to avoid the customization, going on the intent side is quite helpful. And actually, I've seen that. I happened to have discussed recently with people from a few other companies building on intent-based system, and they were usually not working on intent-based automation for their own service, but because they were providing an automation system or a production layer to other teams, to their to multiple developer teams. And that was their way to actually encoding those best practices. That was a very good way of doing that, something that workflow-based is quite often harder to do. It's not, as everything with those computer stuff, it's never impossible, but it's a lot harder with imperative workflows.
So looking over the episode notes here, I see this phrase delta-based production changes. And that's not a phrase that I've actually heard before. So I'm wondering what that actually means and kind of how that relates to this idea of intent-based versus imperative automation. And can that be used for either? Is it like an entirely different idea? I'm just not really sure how to parse that phrase.
Yeah, I think that's also one of those things which is correlated, but not the same, in a sense. Okay, so what do I call delta-based changes? So, in the end, the kind of automation we've been talking about is about maintaining your infrastructure, maintaining your production. So, and that's maintaining it in the face of changes. You want to change it, because if you don't want to change it, well, there is nothing to automate, and we can all go on. It will be also boring and unlikely to live long, but so we are here to deal with changes to your system. And when you introduce a change to your system, there are two big ways of doing it. either by delta or by absolute value. So specific example, you want to change the number of tasks you're running for a job, so the number of replica in a Kubernetes deployment, for example. You can either send to your system or indicate somewhere, oh, by the way, I want plus 10, I want 10 extra tasks. Or you can carry around the change that you want to have 50 tasks, because before you had 40 tasks, now your target is 50 tasks, it's not plus 10. So it is related in sense of workflow versus intent, because intent naturally goes toward having the absolute value, while with workflow, it's very tempting to have those delta. It can get tricky also when you look at the details, and that's where it gets messy, because as in the abstraction, when you look really inside it, depending on how you look at it, it can differ. So what might start as a plus 10 might be then converted later in your pipeline as an absolute value. And so the reason I was mentioning that, and I guess, it mostly applies. Does it mostly apply to intent? No, actually, it probably applies to both. Is that so? The problem we've seen with delta-based changes, so where you carry around the change you want, the delta you want to apply, so like those plus 10 tasks, is that production never ends up in the state you want somehow. That's also one of those big mysteries, that production is always more complex than you expect. And so when you're just carrying around those plus 10, you're going to have problems. For example, you might guarantee at least one semantics. Well, now you've added 20 tasks instead of 10 because something in the middle failed. Well, not good. While if you add the absolute value, you can retry as many times, it will be still 50 tasks in the end. And I've lost my train of thought. Sorry about that.
And I also didn't know what delta-based production change. I mean, I did know what it was, I guess, but I didn't heard that term.
So there is this thing that it's difficult to guarantee the semantic of your changes. Idempotence is great for automation, because computer system, you can usually either guarantee at most once or at least once. And with delta, that's difficult to manage. And the other one is bootstrapping. And quite often you want to understand whether production is actually matching your intent or what you're supposed to have. Or maybe you had a big outage, so you had to take down many things, you want to recreate it. And you need this absolute value. You need this 50 task. And if you just had like delta applies, it might be very hard to reconstruct. We had some cases where those, which were particularly hard to work with, where those delta were themselves being transformed into other type of resources. Imagine that you're increasing an amount of quota. But this quota, it's, let's imagine, I don't know, it's something like your database quota. But your database to run needs some compute resources. So when you ask, like, my database to be twice as big, that means, maybe I need now 3 new servers, a bit more quota on my pub-sub system, whatever. But this translation varies over time. Because, today, doubling the size of your database or adding like 2 extra servers on your database might mean having only 1 new compute, like actual machine. Maybe in 6 months, that will mean 3 machines, or maybe that will be optimized, it will work differently. And so this translation function between what you're asking in the first place and what you're getting in the end changes over time. And if you manage that with delta, well, in 1 year, you will have no idea why you have the resources in the end. There was a bunch of requests. You can probably look at the history of the request, but you're not going to have a good time as that. So dealing with absolute values when you can is great. It still makes sense from a human perspective to have some places where you can just say, I want 10 extra gigs of memory, because that's how we think about the problem quite often. But as soon as possible, that should probably be managed to absolute value when you can, and that will make your... I think I have a strong opinion on that one. That will make your automation probably work better.
Yeah, it sounds to me like the major problem there is that with Delta-based, you're adding an additional dependency back to the current state of production.
Yeah,
I really like how you put it. That is exactly that. Yes, you add a dependency on your current state, and in general, we try to avoid that. Mentions this thing prospect. So prospect, in a nutshell, that's a representation of our configuration at Google. And one very strong principle we have is that we can rebuild this configuration without looking at production. It makes it easier for many small things, some larger than others, like rebuilding something which crashed and disappeared and was deleted by mistake, for example. Yeah, and when you do a delta, that's exactly that indeed. That is that you build on the current state, and the current state, well, it exists only in production, and that quickly has limits here. Yeah. I guess there are some cases where it's still fine. That's all those part of configurations that you never really change. Like you initially created your service in your cloud provider interface. Yeah, you did that once for the lifetime of your service. And maybe from time to time you need to change some things there. Not automating that is probably fine.
Yeah. Speaking of complicated things that potentially change, what about continuous enforcement? I guess in particular too, I know way back we were talking about when to apply certain principles to, intent versus imperative systems or workflow systems. So I don't know, do you have...
Continuous enforcement. Yes, that's also something I feel a bit strongly about, continuous enforcement. So first, continuous enforcement, the idea of continuous enforcement is that assume that you're managing your production by having a configuration somewhere. Maybe it's in a Git repository, maybe it's in a database. You have your configuration somewhere, and you have the state of production elsewhere. And you need to reconcile that. So typically you update your configuration, and then you want production to be updated. And the idea of continuous enforcement is saying that the moment you modify your configuration, it's going to be automatically applied to production. So one aspect I think is more of a, it's more of a policy question, is that what do you want for your system? Do you want actually to have someone having to trigger explicitly this step or not? And I do believe there are, I don't have a good example in mind, but I think there are cases where it might make sense. But for me, that's a policy decision. That should not be guided by the limitation of your system. The technical limitation is that, I'm deciding that I want someone to actually push that. And I guess that ties to the explicit human validation, like having confirmation by someone reviewing it. And that ties into that. Yeah, I do want this explicit step. And okay, you're not going to have really continuous enforcement there. Or what you say is that, what I have as a configuration, for me, for all matter and purposes, that is a state of production. So just make it happen. Safely, hopefully, but make it happen. And that's where you will want continuous enforcement. Now, what I've noticed is that production is always more complicated than what people think. I don't know why. That's and people who are expert in their own production and they still get trapped. And me first, to be very clear, that's always trapped by, there was this thing. I never thought about this interaction. I never even thought about this domain of problems. So things are always more complicated than what we expect. And what we end up finding with systems which do not use continuous enforcement is that there are deltas. I should not use delta. There are differences which creep up between the configuration and the state of production. And so those differences are going to creep up. And then someone arrives, they did their own change to the configuration, and they wanted to push it. And suddenly they try to update production, and when they update production, there is not only their change, but like 2 weeks of changes by other people, which they probably have no clue about in general. And that has led to many outages, actually. We have a certain number of postmortem, which are basically that, that was not pushed. When we pushed it, it was not the right time anymore to push it, or other variations thereof, and suddenly things go wrong. So by having continuous enforcement, you avoid this whole class of problem. That's basically avoiding a whole class of problem. Extra advantage, you're changing production closer to the moment where someone changed the configuration. And this elapsed time between a change of configuration and a change of production is important because the longer it is, the harder it is going to be to debug because the assumption might have changed. Like, I've changed we configure our cache. Yes, but in the meantime, there was another server which was introduced, which was impacting the cache differently. That's one aspect. The other aspect is just older in the past. So maybe the person who did the change in the first place thought, I'm on call currently, so I'm going to watch it. But then now that the other on-caller who is taking care of that when it gets actually pushed and they have no clue about it. Or you might just have forgotten about it. I mean, I see that when I write code is that I usually forget what I did the last week. And for production configuration, there is no reason that it is any different. So continuous enforcement is going to help you tremendously with that. It is tricky. We are talking about getting confidence into a system. So it's usually a relatively difficult step because it's a change in mindset. because you have to trust the machines to do the thing automatically. You don't have this push tool that you run, which can be a difficult change, and you have to build your confidence that it is going to do the right thing at the right moment, that you have encoded all of the constraints, is that, oh yeah, that actually pushed in the middle of the weekend something which was very risky. Yeah, why? Yeah, because someone submitted a change on the Friday and that started the change. And then, yeah, next thing you know, you woken up on Sunday at 6 a.m. And so those things need to be encoded. So that's work to set up a continuous deployment. I think it's very, very often worth it. Very often worth it. There are probably cases where it's not. I would guess that's when the automation does not do a good job at evaluating the result, for example. But more often than not, I think it's good to have. And that doesn't prevent you to have an explicit manual step of approval if there was a policy where was that makes sense. It also helps for something else, actually, the continuous employee. It also helps for something else, the continuous deployment. I don't think it's specific to Google, but I've seen it mostly at Google, is that for turn-up management. So that probably mostly applies to large services where you quite often need to set up a new copy of your stack because you're growing your service regularly or you're moving it around and so on. So some of it tends to be Google specific, but anyone with a large service will probably have to quite often turn up a new instance of your service. And I've seen countless attempts at automatizing that. And that always started with someone documenting the process, the newbie on the team being the one having to do the next turn-up. Terrible experience, but it allows you to learn about the system. So that's how it goes.
This sounds familiar.
It sounds like me. Okay. I did this very recently.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah. Yeah, it happens, exactly. So I've seen many attempts of saying, okay, that is actually very well documented. We know exactly the steps that we need to have. Let's have instead this workflow, this script, this automation tool, which is going to take care of the turn-up. And when this approach is taken, I've never seen that working. I've never seen an actual example where the end result was actually better than doing it manually. And it was also quite often more frustrating because what was happening is that first there was many steps which were manual anyway because there was not the underlying automation and the work was not put into having the actual underlying automation. And so it was still manual anyway. And more importantly, things were breaking over time because those things, even if those turn-ups are more frequent than people expect, it's still like maybe once a month, once every 2 weeks. And so the assumptions behind the this turn-up documentation changes. And there is always a step broken, always. And when the step is broken, well, when you did it manually, yeah, you know which command you run, so you can debug it. It's not pleasant, but you can debug it. When it's your automation doing that, then you have no idea. You have this step in the middle with a crappy error, like context deadline exceeded, which failed, and it's impossible to debug. And I've never seen this approach work. What I've seen working for turnups was taking the problem completely sideways through continuous deployment, continuous enforcement. In the sense that here we're completely changing the problem, instead we're saying that we are modeling production. That's what our production should look like at any point in time. And we continuously enforce that. So that provides you turn-up almost for free in the first place because, well, it's part of the modeling. So to do a turn-up, you just add your new cluster. How complicated can that be? And you get your new cluster turn-up. It's great. And also, it means that when the architecture is changing of your service, which happens, again, more often than people think of, well, because the continuous enforcement, continuous deployment is always running, then we have to fix it immediately when they are changing. They add this new cache server. Well, it will have to be part of the modeling that you're doing. And if it's not, it's going to blow up in someone's face very, very quickly. So you will have this quick feedback loop, which makes it easier to debug in the end. And that's the only approach I've seen working for managing those turnups in practice. And I guess that will apply for any type of automation that you do often, but not that often. And that provides a solution for that.
Yeah, as mentioned, I did relatively recently, just because I'm relatively new to SRE, turn up a service, but I also recently turned down a service. Is that any different in terms of your recommendations there?
Turn downs. I don't know if I have a recommendation. I have a very warning signs when it comes to turn downs. I have not yet found a good way of managing intent by the turn downs. So one is that turndowns are doomed to be seen as a symmetric problem of turn up. And they are very different problems in practice. I do understand the symmetry of it. That's in my mind, I like the symmetry of systems. That's great. But it's a completely different problem. Because the turn up, when you screw it in the middle, the consequence is usually 0. Because that's your new cluster. Your new cluster, you forgot to turn up the front end. Well, no one is impacted because you're not sending traffic there. Mostly. I mean, things get complicated, but usually the risk is much lower. The turn down, yeah, any mistake, you're going to have an outage. That's roughly the baseline. And it might be worse than that. We were talking about deleting data. And when there is one thing which keeps me up at night when it comes to automation is deleting data. Because if I take down the front end, hey, not great. No, I'm not going to be happy about that. I'm going to be stressed, but that's easy to fix. If I'm deleting a large chunk of data, that's a lot more complicated to recover. And we have backup and so on, but still, it's very, very complicated to deal with. So first, there is a big risk aspect of turndown, which is very hard to deal with. So here's our few tricks. A common trick, for example, for turndown of stateful data, of actual data, is that you make it inaccessible. So if you have an ACL system, so some security system, you say, okay, I'm not deleting the data, but as a first step of my turndown, I'm saying that, yeah, you cannot access it anymore. And then you realize that when everyone told you that, yes, they're not using this data anymore, you find people who actually are still using this data. And they have a small outage, but it's a small outage, and then you remove the ACL and everyone is happy again. So that's one trick. After that, how to deal with turndown of intent-based? It's tricky. There is one pattern I think should be absolutely avoided in most cases is turndown, what I call turndown by absence. So there is one thing which is very tempting to do when you have a relatively clean intent, a relatively clean description of what your production should be. Something which is very tempting is to say, okay, but it means that anything that is in production but not in my intent, in some scope, should be removed. Because that's an easy way then to manage your turndown. You just remove it from your config and it gets deleted. And that works. I will not use that for anything more beyond tests, let's say, or really, really not important production or production which can be down for an hour or two without problem. Because in practice, well, configuration gets wrong. That's probably one of the biggest failure usually with configurations is that something gets generated in the middle, there is a bug in that. It's extremely common. And then suddenly you have only half of your configuration which is generated. Oops, you don't have your production anymore. And there are all variations of that where the automation, something will go slightly wrong, and suddenly you don't have your production anymore. The approach we've been taking instead is that we need an explicit signal. So is that you model also what needs to be done. Your job, you still describe it, but you add a bit which indicates that it needs to be done. Managing this information gets tricky. Yeah, for me, that's still an area of research. That might be overselling it, but still something where we are iterating on how to manage that. Another pattern I've noticed is that, which makes it harder, is that how people think about turndown. So what happens for large services, especially, which is where my experience comes from, is that with Gmail, like large service, is that when you turn down something, it's not a one-step process. It's many steps, and it can take sometimes weeks. So imagine that you want to turn down a cluster and you have a lot of user data there. So you will want to move this user data first. But while that is happening, which can take a lot of time, you still want to serve those users, obviously. So you have this signal of turndown that you're starting the turndown at one point, but you're still serving. So you still need to have your job running. You might still need to update them, even if that's taking a long time. If that's taking more than a day, you probably still want to update them. But that's usually not how people approach it. Usually it's more, oh yeah, I want to get rid of this flag, so I'm first going to remove it from the configuration, and then I'm going to clean things up. And that sounds a bit obvious when said like that, but I've noticed that again and again. I've done it myself also. Yes, that makes the problem a lot more complicated because once the configuration has been completely removed, and that you don't want to do turndown by absence because it's dangerous, what do you do then? Which signal do you use? How do you even identify when needs to be turned down? So yeah, in general, we're navigating that, trying to do a mix of adding extra safety measure. There is an infinite string of defensive measures that we can add, and trying to provide various tools to avoid people shooting themselves in the foot, or us holding the foot gun, I guess, in some cases. Another thing with automation is that automation can be safer, and I think it's safer in many cases. But the failure mode is very different from humans. Is that when someone is in control, it's more likely they're going to do random mistakes. Like really random mistakes. But that will be usually more limited. The automation is not going to do random mistakes because that's what it's been doing like millions of times before. However, when it goes wrong, the mistake is also automated, and that can go much worse in that case. So that's different kind of defenses are needed there.
Oh, thank you for shining some light. So I think I just have one more, hopefully not too lengthy. I'm sure we could do another like episode on this, but kind of a quick question in this frame of mind for you. How close are we as SREs to automating ourselves out of our jobs? Which I know is something people like to riff on a lot.
Yeah. That's a usual saying, especially behind automation, that, okay, what's the goal of automation? Well, I'm lazy. I don't want to do, even if I'm not lazy, actually, I don't want to have anything to do. I don't know. I always find this framing, I mean, I understand the framing. I also like to do other things than the story aspect. My perspective on it usually is that that is about complexity management quite often in the end. And I do believe that we are mostly, all of us are mostly working at fixed amount of complexity. We can deal with a given amount of complexity. And yeah, that's it. And if we simplify something by automatizing it, this complexity is going to shift elsewhere. And this complexity might change a bit over time. For example, you're tired. Yeah, you're not going to be able to cope with something stupid in your automation or something stupid in your code and so on. Or you've just changed team. You're full of energy. So, okay, bring it on. You can understand everything. Well, you can try to understand everything. But overall, there is complexity. So for me, it's not automatizing yourself necessarily out of a job, but it's wondering what to automatize so you can shift the complexity to a place that you actually care about having complexities there. There is an obvious answer to that quite often, which is related to automatizing yourself out of a job. You will usually want to move toward being able to take on more feature or more services with less people. That's quite often going to be in that direction, the simplification, of course. But given that it's not a one-step process, thinking about where is the complexity and which complexity you're willing to trade off instead is a framing that I find interesting, because your automation comes with its own complexity. You will have to manage your automation, and it can be more or less good. And there are some places where the automation is going to be a lot more complex to manage than some others. Sometimes the automation is a no-brainer, so that's easy. But sometimes the automation has a cost to maintain it, like how to automatically evaluate your push. Is that worth like doing all those fancy statistical system? Someone has to understand it, and that's not going to be me, that's for sure. And what do we do with that? Do we want to move the complexities there? Well, okay, I'm going to catch up on my statistics, maybe. Yeah, in the end, we are dealing with complexity, and where do we shift it? Complexity is also, I guess it's also related to what people enjoy doing, more or less. Because there are some type of work that one person is going to find extremely frustrating, while the next person, yeah, it's a bit repetitive, but okay, I phase out, I'm taking care of that, I'm used to it, and I'm going to enjoy it, so it might even differ between people. And that's where then it goes into team management, but that's a whole different kind of form, obviously.
Well, thank you so much for coming to chat with us today about all of this. I definitely found it very interesting and informative, so yeah.
Thanks a lot for hosting and for all the good question. I also enjoyed it a lot, so
great.
I hope others will do also.
And we want to make sure that our listeners know that just at the end of last year, you had your author on a white paper for ProdSpec and annealing, which are Google's current solutions to these problems.
Exactly, yeah.
We will have a link to that white paper in our episode notes for folks that want to follow up with that.
Yeah, I describe everything that we're doing nowadays for continuous deployment to a large extent to automation. It's very long because I tend to give a lot of details, but I hope people find some interesting bits in there.
Yeah, we'll definitely link it here so folks can head on over All right. I think that's all. So thank you again. And we will be back with an episode next time on On Call. So see you all then.
Thank you.
Thanks.